Hello and welcome to DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Ming Wong.
And I'm Bill McQueen. Push Ontario closed its doors last year. They advocated for the 1.6 million people with disabilities who live in the province. On today's show, we'll hear from some members of local and regional organizations that are filling the gap left by Push's departure.
And also later in today's program, we'll take a trip to Yuck Yuck's Comedy Club in Toronto. We'll meet Alan Shane, an Ottawa comedian who's taking his show on the road.
First, here's this week's Disability News highlights. This week, the Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights and the Status of Disabled Persons began its review of proposed legislation that would broaden Canada's employment equity law. Bill C-64, which has passed first reading, would add another 230,000 federal employees to those covered by equity legislation. The bill would require companies employing more than 100 people to adopt plans for increasing representation of the designated groups.
The impetus for employment equity was not merely that designated groups were underrepresented, but because they were, and because they still are, underrepresented relative to their position in the qualified labor force.
Employers would have to set numerical goals, and the Canadian Human Rights Commission will be responsible for seeing that the law is enforced. That could include fines up to $50,000. The segregation of people with disabilities can occur at any age. So can integration. The inclusion of children with disabilities in the school system at an early age is important. The unique daycare center in Montreal is an excellent example, according to daycare specialist Amy Driscoll. John Curtin reports.
You have to take a pretty close look at these kids to tell which are disabled. But nearly half of the class is. They're not made to feel it, though, and that makes all the difference.
Oh, no! This daycare has given my son the opportunity to be a child, to be with other children who are not disabled, to realize his potential.
Okay.
That's not something 6-year-old Morgan could have done in many other places in Quebec. The majority of daycares accept only a tiny % of disabled children, if any at all.
There's often a fear on the part of parents and the part of educators that by accommodating such diverse needs, they may not be able to do such a good job for the rest of the children.
Not true when it's done right, says Driscoll, who cited Papillon as exemplary in her recent book on innovative North American daycares. Exemplary for its staff, its techniques, and for accepting so many disabled children into its regular curricula.
Well, it gives them that chance to have role models and to see how other children do things and to be able to go to their maximum in their activities and say, okay, this is what I want to do and how am I going to get around my physical disability to attain my goal.
This is no one-way street. Children without disabilities have as much to gain.
Think about what kind of sensitivity they take out into the world as adults from having this experience as a young person.
The Inuit people of northern Quebec are much more likely to have a disability than other Canadians. 12% of the population and 25% of the school children have hearing problems. These hearing impairments are caused by middle ear infections, meningitis, and exposure to loud sounds like snowmobiles. So some people in Inuktitut are teaching American Sign Language, or ASL. However, there are many words in the Inuit language that have never been translated into ASL. Inuit families met recently to discuss the formation of a Deaf Inuit Association which would develop sign languages that include local expressions. All that Russell Rogers wants is his share of Newfoundland's moose harvest. But so far, the province has said no because Rogers is legally blind. He's not giving up, though, and he's taking his case to the Supreme Court of Canada. Carmel Smith prepared this report.
He has a better chance of dealing 4 aces at his kitchen table than he does of shooting and killing a moose. Russell Rogers is legally blind. He has only 10% of normal vision, but that hasn't stopped him from a 10-year fight.
Why? Because I feel I'm as entitled to a couple of quarters of moose meat as the next person in this province. Just because I have a disability, that doesn't mean a roll of beans.
Rogers admits he can't see well enough to shoot. He doesn't want to. In Newfoundland's moose license lottery, several people apply for a single license. Only one hunter shoots the animal. But entering in partners increases the chances of getting a license. So Rogers says he should be able to enter with a qualified partner.
I don't want any special treatment. All I do want is the right to apply, like everyone else.
But everyone else has to pass a shooting test. So the rules would have to change to accommodate Rogers. And for the last 10 years, the courts and the province have agreed that being able to use a firearm is a fundamental requirement of a license. Newfoundland's Human Rights Commission disagrees. It says exceptions have to be made for people with disabilities. So the commission is paying for Rogers' fight all the way to the Supreme Court.
So there's been no denial throughout this process that the moose license itself is a public service. Now, the next step is accommodation. Mr. Rogers has been denied this service, the moose license, because he has a disability, and what extent of accommodation is required.
Rogers doesn't know if the Supreme Court will hear his case, but after 10 years of waiting, he's not about to give up now.
3 federal by-elections are coming up on February 13th. Here's a reminder about some accommodations and voting services available to voters who have a disability. Level access will be available to all voters. For people with disabilities who live in institutions, mobile polls will again be used. A TDD information line will be provided for people who are hard of hearing. Those voters who are visually impaired will be provided with a special template to mark their ballots. If an individual is unable to get into a polling site, they will be able to vote by using special mail-in ballots. If you'd like more information about these and other services, call the following toll-free numbers: 1-800-267-VOTE or TDD's 1-800-361-8935. And that's this week's Disability News Highlights.
When we come back, disability organizations in Ontario look forward. A few weeks ago, the Toronto Star ran a major story on the demise of Push Ontario, the province-wide advocacy organization for people with disabilities. PUSH, which is short for People United for Self-Help, advocated on behalf of 1.6 million people with disabilities in the province. We won't look at what happened to PUSH. It's a complicated story and involves legal actions. Instead, we'll look at why such an organization is needed. Earlier, Bill spoke with 3 people who are active in local and regional consumer associations across the province. Marilyn Wharf is with the regional organization Push Northwest. They're located in Thunder Bay. John Feld is with Transaction, a coalition that advocates for accessible transportation. And Bruce Wenham is with Disabled People Working Together. All 3 organizations are cross-disability in nature.
Marilyn, can you tell us what a cross-disability organization is like?
We operate cross-disability because in many cases the issues that pertain to people with disabilities cross into all different disabilities so that we can address things from the perspective of persons with mobility and sensory and psychiatric and developmental disabilities, because there are common issues. Long-term care, accessibility, transportation, social security, assistive devices, and the list goes on.
There's a large common denominator around the issue of disability, and it's quite possible to advocate, for example, for one sector or one disability-specific area and ignore other areas. But what happens when you put together cross-disability, you come up with, here's the basis or the baseline for things like employment equity legislation. And this is why it's so important to have cross-disability, because it doesn't focus on one particular disability, whether it's a wheelchair user or someone with a developmental disability. What it does, it takes into account the broad range of disability.
I think what's important to take into account is that what people with disabilities have in common is far greater than what keeps them, what separates them.
I think by aiming for cross-disability organisations, one can promote quite effectively the changes that one wants to see happen. Well, I think one of the key things I would like to see is that this whole so-called consumer model is an alternative to what it had been hitherto, a medical model, whereas people with disabilities were generally recipients and passive recipients of fairly paternalistic services. And what is happening with this consumer model and this whole idea of having disability groups run by disabled people, it is that the experts on disability are now making a choice in how programs are delivered. We are quite new to this, and there is a large, steep learning curve. There's a great expectation to what we accomplish, but I think given the opportunity and given the trust to achieve that, it can be done. And I think it's so important because nobody else will do it for us.
Meryl, I was going to ask, how has Push Northwest accomplished that vision in your community?
The consumers started advocating for themselves within those specific organizations, and now it's time that they stepped beyond that to function as a unit and address those issues. But with that forum at the community level, they can address things locally, then they can work regionally, and then feed into provincial, and then again feed into the national disability movement. And I think it's a very productive, because everybody can find in that situation a way to meet their own personal needs, but also develop skills and abilities to advocate for themselves, and then move into advocating as a unit, and then influencing the voice of consumers at the provincial level and the federal level.
And as we look around the province, there is not this generic infrastructure across the province, by no stretch of the imagination. Some places are well organised, some places have no organisation at all. However, when you have, I think, a lot of community-based agencies who get their funding from various sources, doing their little piece, in terms of trying to put together a provincial policy statement, that is so important to have a vehicle to do that. Now, there used to be one called Push, which managed to basically, in my view, shot itself in the foot. But nature hates a vacuum. And my personal view is that I think in time we will see the re-emergence of a provincial forum for the disparate disability groups, which will represent cross-disability throughout the province.
I think it's absolutely mandatory that we do rebuild a cross-disability coalition at the provincial level. From the perspective of us in the north, we can all formulate our opinions on issues and really, come to a collective decision on those things, but we need that coalition so that we can feed that information through.
I'm working with some others to try to cobble together a new coalition around disability rights. And it's very, very early stages of development, but our hope is that within the near future we will be able to bring this about.
I just think that there's so many persons with disabilities out there that have the ability and the knowledge. If people from cross-disability groups and organizations pool their resources and their knowledge and build a coalition so that the federal government and the provincial government or our national coalition can, in fact, pick up the phone or speak to individuals, and we can make the network work where we can really find out what the consumers in the province want and need and think and believe. So I think it's long overdue that we get to work and rebuild a coalition at the provincial level.
Thank you for joining us on the program today.
Push Ontario was the provincial representative to the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. There are similar advocacy organizations representing the other provinces. While a new province-wide organization in Ontario is forming in the wings, many associations which made up the network continue to be active in their communities. If you'd like a list of organizations, write to us. We'll give you our address at the end of the program, and we'll keep you posted on developments.
Coming up next, comedy on the road.
It's been said that laughter is the best medicine, but in Alan Shane's case, laughter is a tool. Shane is a comedian who often performs at Yuck Yuck's comedy clubs. He uses humor to educate the public about people with disabilities. We caught up with him at a recent performance in Toronto.
I went to a speech therapist, and as you can hear, it really did wonders.
Alan Shane likes to make people laugh, but his jokes aren't just about making the audience chuckle. He has a message he wants people to think about.
Because all that snow turned my outdoor wheelchair run into a toboggan run.
Shane has cerebral palsy, a physical disability that affects his speech and mobility. His jokes are about how he lives with his disability. And while the audience is laughing, Shane hopes they've learned something new about people with disabilities.
I hope it achieves the change of attitude in the general public to see disability as part of life and part of society. I'm walking down Young Street, and this person who I don't even know comes up and says, "Hey, I know this guy in Manitoba. He's got one leg. You gotta know him."
Shane's humor deals with the everyday issues of living with a disability, like how able-bodied people sometimes treat people who are disabled.
And then I went to Vancouver to a big conference where there were 3,000 people there, each with their own disability. And people around the streets of Vancouver were going, "Holy shit, what a huge family reunion." Humor really helps to put people at ease, and humor is useful in making a point, making people aware about the issues.
I think people have certain stereotypes that people with disabilities are maybe not very smart, maybe not very capable of doing things on their own, and for someone to be a stand-up comedian and have disabilities is probably very eye-opening to some people.
I like people coming up to me saying, you know, I never thought about disability in that way before.
He's achieved a great thing right there. He's funny and he's broken a barrier, and from then on it's an even scene.
But while Shane educates the public, he still has to face barriers. Shane has to be helped up the stage by Yuck Yuck's manager, Christopher Quinn. Quinn says there isn't a real need to make the stage accessible.
It's all relative, also subject to need, you know. We don't see Alan that often. He plays out of Ottawa most of the time. But Gord Painter, who is a comedian with Yuck Yucks, is visually impaired. He's blind. And we escort him on stage, and we face him toward the audience so he knows where he is, and we tell him where the center of the stage is. He stands there with a cane, and he feels himself about. We try as much as possible, you know, within what we require at this point in time. If Alan came here a little more often, I think we'd be more inclined to try and do something that would enable him more. But it hasn't presented itself yet. But I hope it does.
The waiter comes over, asks my brother, "How many menus do you want?" "Well, oh yeah, there's two of us at the table." "How was it for?"
But at the end of the night, all that matters is what the audience has learned from Alan Shane.
People with disabilities are like everyone else. We have the same needs, the same desires, and we shouldn't be segregated from the general society.
Alan Shane hopes to come to a town near you. He wants to take his act across Canada to educate more people about disability issues.
When we come back, keeping in touch with the news.
Earlier this season, we reported on a method recently developed to provide access to the Globe and Mail to people who are blind or visually impaired. Now, several nonprofit groups have set up a similar program for people in Montreal. It gives them access to several major newspapers and magazines. Jerry Bearer explains.
Alan Conway is blind, and he needs to keep up with the news. He's an interpreter at the House of Commons in Ottawa.
I don't know how many times I've been asked by people, can you get access to newspapers? And up to now, I've had to say no. Today, for the first time, I can say, well, certainly not all of them, but we're off to a really good start.
For starters, every issue of the Globe and Mail, La Presse, Le Soleil, and the entertainment weekly Voir is available at some libraries and to anyone who has a home computer and a Braille interface for it. André Vincent of the Jean Scipio Library shows Conway how the system works.
Let's find the editorial.
The newspapers can also be heard on a voice synthesizer.
Software will be offered free to all Braille or voice synthesizers users of Quebec province, and the fee for the paper will be $25 per month by paper.
Funding for the development of the new technology came from the federal government.
This will certainly help me so that I won't have to at least ask people to read me the articles out of La Presse that are important. It doesn't include others yet, but anything that reduces the need to ask other people to read out loud is always a help.
For Conway, being informed with the news is necessary for his job, the way Maestro is necessary to help him get around.
That's Disability Network this week. We're preempted next week and we'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, we appreciate all your letters, opinions, and story ideas. Write to us. Our address is coming right up. I'm Ing Wong.
And I'm Bill McQueen. Now here is our address. Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. That's Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6.